Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast, or if you're joining me for the first time, welcome to the podcast. This is Happiness You. For those of you guys who have never joined me before, this is a podcast about exploring happiness, potential, and also the potential for human beings in general and just what we're truly capable of. And so for this episode, this most recent episode, I did an interview for positive psychology, which is a branch of psychology exploring, the potential to maximize our own happiness in our lives. And so I interviewed Dr. Dylan Selterman. I took a class with him at Maryland. It was about positive psychology, and it really did change my whole perspective. And I've said this a few times on past podcasts for those of you guys who have been listening to me. And it was really incredible to be able to really pick his mind outside of a classroom setting. So enjoy this podcast. I really hope you guys get a lot out of it. I hope you guys get some solid takeaways because he really does have a lot of great things to say. And he gave a lot of good resources as well as, practical things that we can do to make ourselves feel better and help us understand, if we're struggling, sort of understand the root cause of that struggling. So I hope you guys enjoy this. All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, Happiness You listeners. I am here with Dr. Dylan Selterman, PhD, Doctor of Psychology, teaches at the University of Maryland. I've been waiting for a really long time to be able to do this podcast with him and just talk about positive psychology, talk about living the good life, which is one of the classes that I took with him. And one of the reasons I chose to do Happiness You to begin with. So, Dr. Selterman, tell us a little bit about your educational background. Tell us a little bit about your current research that you got going on, and then a little bit about the Psych 289D class, which was the class I took with you.
Yeah, sure. So I have a PhD in psychology and a specialty in personality and social processes. In terms of my research interests, they include studies about close interpersonal relationships, including romantic relationships and friendships. I also do work on morality and ethics. I'm thinking about whether students not only do they know the material, but do they actually gain something in terms of their well-being, in terms of their happiness? So I'm very interested to explore that further.
Yeah, definitely. And so the class that I did take with you, which was Living the Good Life, it was positive psychology. And in high school, I think a lot of us learned a little bit about positive psychology. We touched on it as one of the smaller little units within the larger scope of psychology. And I actually had a conversation with my former high school psychology teacher in a separate podcast, just about what, happens to that. Why is that such a small part of it? Because after taking your class, I really did get a little bit more opened up to that. And so the nature of positive psychology, I understand it was started by a guy named Martin Seligman, and he was basically this guy in the 80s that stood up at this conference with a bunch of other psychologists and kind of proclaimed, we need to focus on promoting positive circumstances instead of trying to minimize the negative ones, and cultivate the positive life circumstances instead of trying to treat illnesses as they come, so to speak.
Yeah, certainly Dr. Seligman gets credit as one of the people who coined the term positive psychology. It really was not in popular use before that. And he has that famous TED Talk about the idea of positive psychology, which is definitely worth watching. And he outlines some principles that you described. And it's not to say that we should be focusing on the positive aspects instead of the negative aspects, but rather just that the positive aspects are just as important. So it's important for us to study things like depression and anxiety, but it's also important for us to study happiness. And those aren't the same thing. So really what he's suggesting, and I know that positive psychology has become a bit stigmatized and is now kind of associated with pseudoscience.
From my understanding, in my own life and my own perception, I think there's a huge stigma around seeing a psychologist, as they say. You're going to see a psychiatrist, and it's like there's just so much stigma around that phrase, because it's like, okay, you hear that and you're like, oh, in your mind it's like, okay, what's wrong with you? What happened? And I don't necessarily think it needs to be that way. I think it should be looked at something, or it should become something where you're going to see a psychologist, not because there's something wrong with you, but because you want to achieve your full potential. And so that's the kind of stuff that I think would be really beneficial. It would be, it could help people get over these obstacles in their life when they do come. It could, create more of a proactive culture around mental health in general. What do you think about that? Like, how can we change that culture?
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something. And I think there's, to be clear, there's stigma around lots of things in our culture, and destigmatizing mental illness and seeing a psychologist, as you put it, there's various stigmas around physical illnesses and seeing a medical doctor about something that might be physically wrong with you. And I think that it's really part of the same thing in terms of making people feel comfortable with their own vulnerabilities, because we're all going to experience at some point in our life, we're going to experience pain. We're going to experience hardship. We're going to experience suffering. And we need to have the right tools to deal with those things. There's big movements around destigmatizing people's ability to seek help, or I should rephrase that, destigmatizing the seeking of help for psychological ailments. I think part of it can be achieved in terms of just normalizing it and making people realize just how common these things are, and making it a part of people's conversations about well-being at a very early age. So I would love to see, as part of, for example, primary school education, for psychologists to come in and do lessons with kids and just say, look, there's going to be times in your life where you are distressed, and here are the resources available to you. Sometimes for people who are just taking a psychology class for the first time in college, it's completely new to them. Even if they've heard about it, maybe in pop culture, or they've seen therapy in TV shows or movies, which is very often depicted in an inaccurate way, people don't have the tools until it's too late. Well, we can treat it from a normative perspective, and we can make it more common in our discourse with each other to talk about mental health and wellness, and to make it more routine for people to see a psychologist. Part of the reason why people are reluctant has to do with cost, and the notion that mental health services are decoupled from physical health services. But if we gave everyone, say, one free visit to a psychologist, and everyone can go, even if there's absolutely nothing wrong with you and you're totally happy and healthy, you can still go and just learn what the whole thing is about. That would be useful. And there's more people who are comfortable talking with all this stuff now. And you've seen, for example, some NBA stars talking about their mental health issues, guys like DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Love talking about their anxiety. And there's, they're comfortable talking about it, and we're now getting more comfortable hearing about it. So I think the process is moving along well. It's slow.
Yeah. That's interesting what you said about athletes, actually, because I had heard somewhere that I was listening to another podcast, I believe, and it was this guy who was a professional, and most of what he did was work with athletes, because the whole mindset with athletes, I think a lot of times, is that they're out to prove something. They're out to, and I'm not saying this is always the case, but I think it may be the way our culture portrays it. Like you said, a lot of things are stigmatized. Yeah. And what ends up happening is a lot of these athletes get in a position where they are successful, and then they experience sort of that crushing low afterwards, where they realize that either they don't actually love the sport as much as they thought, and they were just doing it for other motivation, other reasons, or whatever the case may be. It's just, it's a difficult position, and he kind of coaches them through that, sort of almost retraining their brain in a sense. And I think a lot of us could use that. A lot of us could use sort of a retraining, just kind of a little shakeup. And I think you're right. I think getting in at the ground level in the educational system is definitely the place to start. Cultivating, those positive institutions for people to really grow up in.
Yeah. And certainly when we're talking about professional athletes, I mean, you could say on a basic level, we're no different. Everyone experiences suffering and everyone needs mental health. Athletes who are in the spotlight, especially in the international media, might have different kinds of struggles that they deal with in terms of fame and notoriety. But I think with regards to the culture, like you're describing, maybe athletes feel they have something to prove and they don't want to show weakness. That's a very real thing. And I think it's going to take a lot of work to make people on the whole, and this includes athletes, this includes people who work in the military or in law enforcement or in business. All of those cultures have this to some degree, this notion that you can't show weakness or vulnerability, otherwise you'll get eaten alive. And that's something that definitely needs to change if people are going to be comfortable reaching out to others for help. And I'm optimistic in the progress that we're making, but we have a long way to go. And I think part of this is going to be achieved by promoting women in all of those fields. And you see the societies with higher well-being tends to have a greater proportion of women in positions of power and influence. And that, I think, could do a lot of good for us.
Yeah, for sure. We're still living in a very much a patriarchal society. So I agree with that completely. So I guess that kind of builds on another question I have for you then. I mean, if you could build your own community from the ground up, how would you set it up and why? And this is kind of just like a play question for you.
Yeah. So this is a fun question because it's almost like, thinking about your utopian vision for how the world should work. And there are some things that I feel more confident in saying than others. Like when it comes to designing healthcare policy, I'm a little bit less confident in the logistics of how that would work and would defer to my expert peers in that area. With regards to something like school, where, because I work in a school, I feel, I have the experience and the knowledge to speak to that. I think that if we're looking at ways in which kids can flourish at an early age, it would be in an environment where their curiosity and their intrinsic motivation would be emphasized very strongly, and the extrinsic motivators would be minimized. And this is something that we talked about to some degree in the 289D class. The notion that we have in our school system that we have now, and this is, I should say, this is cultural. So in America, we have a weird system of norms. This is not the same as they have, for example, in Scandinavian education. But in our culture, we have this weird idea that kids' lives need to be super structured if they are going to learn things and grow their brains effectively and develop naturally and succeed as adults. And what ends up happening is we do a lot of damage, and a lot of the distress that teenagers feel is a function of the high school system. If you look at the trajectories of self-esteem, which correlates with happiness, it's not exactly the same, but they're correlated. It starts out high in childhood on average, which is what we want. Kids feel good. And then it plummets in adolescence. And then it rises gradually as people move through their adult years, and then unfortunately falls again into old age. Now, that can be explained. The old age thing is probably because people's cognitive and physical abilities start to fail them as they get older. And there's also stigma and prejudice associated with the elderly. So you can understand why that effect would happen. But there's no logical reason for people to feel so much worse about themselves and about their lives when they're in their teenage years, I think a lot of that is attributable to the fact that we deprive students in high school and teenagers of their basic freedoms. There's a great book called Teen 2.0 by Robert Epstein, and he describes how prisoners actually have more rights than teenagers in America. And that, I think, is an important piece of it, because if students in school and if young people, if young adults don't have a sense of well-being, if they don't have the ability to flourish when they're young, how can they possibly have it when they're older? It doesn't make any sense. And it's getting worse. If you look at the increase in anxiety and depression, especially amongst teenagers, but overall we see this trend in the general population, it's getting worse as time goes on. So we're trending in the wrong direction with regards to that. And we need, going back to your original question, like if I was designing society, I would essentially get rid of school as we know it now and replace it with a system similar to the one that Nikhil Goyal describes in his book, Schools on Trial, where he talks about learning centers that are based on students' intrinsic curiosities, and they're open to everybody. But the things that people are learning are entirely a function of their own intrinsic goals and their self-determination. And the research shows that when students and when young people are intrinsically motivated, they will learn much, much better than in the system we now have, which is based on grades and standardized tests and things like that. So I recommend checking out those books to learn more. So the ones I mentioned are Teen 2.0, Schools on Trial, and another book by Peter Gray called Free to Learn.
Yeah, I really want to check those out, because I've often thought about sort of in a similar way, growing up in the public school system and the anxiety and the depression that I experienced on a personal level, but then also came to find out later down the road how many of my peers were also struggling with the same thing during that time. And you don't notice it as much when you're also going through it. So it's hard to see it in other people when you're struggling so much yourself. And so in that regard, it isolates you even further, because for me, it was like, okay, what the hell's wrong with me?
Yeah, that's very true.
Like, why is this just happening to me? It doesn't make any sense. So it's kind of this thing where you have to hide it, and you have to, and all these horrible and habits end up being built, whether it's drugs, whether it's, emotional disconnection, just any number of different things. And then you get into mental problems as well, depression and anxiety. But I wholeheartedly agree that there's no reason for that. There's no reason that it has to be that way. There's definitely a normative. I don't know if normative is the right word, but there's this idea that it's normal for teenagers to be depressed and angsty and have all these experiences because of their hormones. And so we just kind of accept it as normal, like we're just going through it. But I definitely think that if the school systems were improved in the way that you had said, or completely overhauled rather, it would be really interesting to try to see the effects of that.
I'm glad you brought up the hormones idea, because that brings me to another theme that I emphasize strongly in the course, which is this idea of neuroscience babble, or Neurobunk, which is the very egregious misinterpretation of physiological and neuroscientific data to support an agenda. And I think this is reaching a crescendo now with social media. The question of, why are people less happy now than in previous years or previous generations? And, that comes up a lot, and people are so quick to point the finger at social media, even though the evidence really does not support that conclusion. And then there's a whole lot of nonsense about, there's dopamine activation when people are on their phones, so it's just like taking drugs. And of course, that's nonsense, because there's dopamine activation with virtually anything that you do that is fun, including eating fruit, or having sex, or playing with your children, or watching sports. And, we would never say that those things are uniformly bad for our mental health or addictive or anything like that. And I'll reference another book here. This one's actually about video games. This one is called Moral Combat, and it was written by Patrick Markey and Chris Ferguson. And they go into an in-depth discussion about the false idea that violent video games make people more violent. But they talk about broadly some ideas that are relevant to discussion of well-being, to addiction, and some of it is also relevant to a discussion of social media and why that idea is just complete nonsense. So I think, platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, they make for a very convenient scapegoat. People can point the finger at those and feel good about themselves, thinking, I've identified the problem. It's this new thing that lots of people are using, and it's fake and superficial, and people are doing all these negative social comparisons, and that makes them, depressed and suicidal.
Yeah.
But again, the evidence suggests that we are, that's a gross oversimplification, and we are much better off looking at more institutional and systemic sources of unhappiness. Like climate change, for example, makes people feel miserable, and nobody's talking about that. I mean, people, when they talk about climate change, they focus mostly on rising sea levels and rising temperatures, which is all, well and good. That's important. We should talk about that. But there's also a literature about how the change in the weather makes people unhappy. And we ought to be talking about that. And we don't, because we're so fixated on people's news feeds and why that might be making them unhappy. But again, the evidence is just not there.
Yeah. No, I've never even heard of that as a legitimate idea. The fact that the weather or the changing climate, which you can say what you want, but it is changing, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, the fact that could be something, I think it goes to show how our culture tends to gravitate towards one thing and just cling on to it for dear life. It's like we have to have something to blame, and it has to make sense to us based on the world that we understand. And I've had this conversation with one of my roommates several times. There's nothing inherently bad about social media in my eyes, but the problem is the way that people use it most of the time. And people mostly use it, for me, it would be either I was bored or I was already upset or frustrated. And so that was why I would gravitate towards using social media. It was like a compulsion. But inherently, I think social media is actually one of the greatest things ever created, because it allows people to connect with one another. It allows people to build businesses and lifestyles that they never could have, generations ago. I always love following Gary Vee on social media and listening to him talk about how lucky we are to be living in this age, this internet age. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and we can tie this in nicely to the psychology of happiness and think about the motivations people have to use social media. And the strongest evidence we see in terms of looking at social media use and looking at well-being data, the strongest evidence is just about a correlation between the general tendency people have towards emotional distress or negative affect, and then using it and feeling more upset. So, Facebook depression, quote unquote, correlates with general depression. So it is probably what you're describing, where people feel negative emotion and they use social media in a way that seems to be confirming and reinforcing that pre-existing negative affect. So for that reason, and this is just a practice that I have myself, this is anecdotal. I don't know if there's any data. I would love to see a study on this, but for myself, I don't use social media when I'm feeling down or when I'm feeling sick. I will turn those apps off on my phone and revisit them when I'm feeling better, unless there's something very pressing that's work related, which is rare for me at least. And, other people, depending on their jobs, might have different circumstances. But if you're using certain functions of social media and you're already feeling down, that might make things worse. But on the whole, there's no reason to think that just using it will somehow make people feel bad in general. And I'm glad you brought that up also about, the functions we have to use. I was at a Citizens Climate Lobby meeting just the other day. And this is an advocacy group that also works on climate change, speaking of climate change. So we were in the Petworth Library in DC, and we went around the room and just mentioned how we had heard about the meeting, and virtually everyone said that they had heard about the meeting through some kind of social media. And I noted at the beginning of the meeting that was remarkable given the negative stigma about social media, that it actually brought us together for this very positive cause. And that's something that I think people don't take the time to be mindful about, is just, how we're using these tools to enhance our lives.
Yeah. Yep. You're absolutely right. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know you said, you have somewhere to be. So
we can do a few more minutes if there's one or two more questions that are really burning questions you want to go for.
That's all right. You put me on the spot here. What lasting piece of advice would you give to someone, as like a general, like 1 point takeaway, someone who is maybe quietly suffering, maybe they're not, they want to make a change, but they're not really sure exactly how. Just like one piece of advice that you could give someone who is struggling, and based on like the way that they're either living their lives, or maybe it's like the way that they see the world. Like, what is one piece of advice you could give to that person based on your experience with positive psychology, and as a doctor of psychology?
Sure. Well, let me say this. First of all, if someone suspects that they might have a mental illness, the best thing that they can do for themselves is to seek professional treatment as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. If that's, not necessarily the case, but a person still is feeling a bit negative in their life overall, they feel like they're suffering. There's stuff that we know with more confidence than other things. And the research very clearly shows a link between things like doing mindfulness meditation, gratitude expression, acts of altruism and volunteering. So you can do yourself a whole lot of good by practicing those things in your daily life. And there's resources, I'm sure, for you to volunteer in your community, whether it's something like, working at a food kitchen or volunteering at a local school, and to practice mindfulness meditation. There's some great free resources online. I'll recommend Tara Brock's websites for some free guided meditations there. And overall, I think, those are things that you can do to improve your own psychological well-being. But putting that aside for a second, I think people, when they think about happiness and they think about wellness, they're thinking about it much in the way that you described, which is an individual person is feeling negative. What can that person do to help themselves? And I think that's fine, but it's incomplete. And what I like to emphasize in my teaching, especially because I'm a social psychologist, is to look at the bigger picture, to look at society. Are people flourishing in America? Why or why not? And can we take a lesson from some other cultures that appear to be much happier and have higher well-being than us? What are those other countries doing? Because then you start to see how societal and institutional forces that are beyond an individual's ability to control are nonetheless making a huge difference in our well-being. So something like income inequality is associated with unhappiness. So the greater inequality there is in terms of the wealth distribution in any given country is associated with the people in that country feeling less happy. And that's something that is not, again, it's not something under an individual person's control. You have to mobilize, you have to create social movements together to change those institutions. But that's going to do a whole lot of good, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you in your community, including your friends and family. And so I recommend that people think big when they think about happiness, and not just think about themselves as individuals, but think about everyone that they are socially connected to, and to think about, okay, well, what are other people, what are other nations, what are other societies and cultures doing that might work here? And to think about ways to implement those kinds of changes on a mass scale. That is, I think, part of the purpose of my work is to do exactly that, not just to teach students at the University of Maryland about how to make themselves happier, but to get them to see the power that they have and the strength they have in numbers to act collectively for their own good together as a community. That's something that I struggle with. It's something that I really hope my students get, but I'm still working on it.
Yeah, definitely not an easy undertaking by any means, but nonetheless important to strive for. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Selterman. I really do appreciate you taking the time to sort of explain the backgrounds, the basis, upon which I really decided to take this step. It's been a long time coming. I took your class 2 years ago, and I just started Happiness U like a couple months ago. But nonetheless, I think that your way of teaching, clearly you care about this subject and you care about people's well-being, and really just, how we can understand ourselves better in order to live better lives. And I think that's something worthwhile. And that's something that I think I strive to do, even though I'm not a psychologist. So thank you again for joining me.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Thank you guys again for listening. If you love the podcast, please give it a subscribe. Please give it a share, a like, whatever it is, wherever you're listening. Please make sure that you're keeping up with all the latest content. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and take care.